So, you like the Black Dog Chronicles, and you'd like to help it out? Well, here's some ways you can. Firstly, push the like button, and then comment below. Share this video with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media. Or if you like the idea of me staying alive and eating, you can give me a tip here on the channel. You just select this icon here and tip whatever you like. I'm grateful for any support you can give. And now, with all that out the way, let's get on with the tale. The Taily-po. Retold and read for you by Huw Carr. This is a story that has been whispered by many, but truly remembered by only a few. The protagonist of the tale has been given many names: Smitty by some accounts, Old Man Fletcher by others. But from Ernest Norton, who was the grandson of Cedar Norton, who led the fated search party, I learned that the solitary recluse of who this story tells was known locally as Old Jack. Long ago, Old Jack had given up on the type of life that you and I know well. One day he walked away from his home and all that he knew, and fashioned for himself a small shack hewn from the trees of the mountains of West Virginia. All that he brought with him from his old life were the three things he loved best: his faithful hounds. The three dogs kept him company on the long, lonely nights. Their names were I Know, You Know, and Calico. Despite the affection he showed to his dogs, Old Jack shunned the company of everyone for scores of miles around. Ernest Norton told me that Jack wasn't well liked. Some in the district accused him of stealing from them to bolster his scant supplies in lean times. For the most part, though, Jack used to hunt for meat in the woods and lakes around the mountains. Due to his advanced age, pickings were often scarce, and on many a night, Jack went home hungry. His log cabin only had one room. He had placed his makeshift bed on one wall, and across from that was the small fireplace. On warm nights, his dogs would sleep on the porch or in the crawl space under it. But on the cold and sharp winter nights that sliced down from high snow-topped mountains, they would sleep about his feet as he sat in a rickety chair by the fireplace, warming his old bones. There came a time when Old Jack had spent 3 days without finding anything to hunt or steal. His belly ached with the pains of his hunger, and the weather was so frightful that he couldn't sleep, and so he couldn't escape his hunger. He'd used up all his supplies but a handful of dry beans. He threw them into his cast-iron pot, where they landed with a hollow rattle. He poured in some water from his gourd dipper, added a pinch of salt, and then put them over the fire to cook. Slowly, the water in the pot began to boil. After a while, Old Jack dipped his wooden spoon in and tasted the beans. They were still hard. Old Jack grimaced as he swallowed the rough mouthful. Why did beans take so long to cook? His stomach grumbled, and he knew that the measly handful of beans wouldn't be enough to satisfy his belly. He needed meat, maybe some salt pork or a slab of fatback. His mouth watered at the thought. He settled back in his old chair and stared into the golden flames, listening to the bubbling of the beans. Logs burned down into coals. Old Jack sighed and picked up another log to add. It was too big to fit under the pot, so he grabbed his hatchet and split it into 4 pieces. He was just about to try the beans again when he heard a scratching sound coming from under the floorboards. He looked down where he knew there was a hole in the floor, a hole that he had been for a long time meaning to fix but hadn't, and he saw a black furred paw with long claws stretching out of the hole. His old eyes grew wider as he watched as the claws dug into the wood and scratched viciously. The wood about the hole splintered and cracked and crumbled away, and the hole widened. The paw, which he now saw was unlike any animal paw he had ever seen before, had long, tapering and sinewy fingers that looked more like a human hand, was followed by another paw, and then, even more horrible than the paws, a head appeared, thick as a panther's but hideously long, with wickedly curved fangs that jutted out around a slavering mouth. The dark, bestial head was set with a pair of glittering red eyes. Jack watched in frozen horror as bit by bit the creature shattered the wood of the planks and pulled its long, lank body into the shack. It was lithe like a weasel, but easily the size of the largest of his dogs. Perhaps the queerest thing about it was its strangely thick, meaty tail that hung limply behind it, all but dragging on the floor. The tail was hairless and pink, like an overweight rat's. When the creature saw old Jack, it humped up its back and hissed, revealing all of its long, pointed, and dagger-like white teeth. Suddenly Jack broke from the paralyzed terror in which he had sat frozen still and leapt for his hatchet. The creature snarled once, and then sprang around and tried to dive back down the hole. It was fast, but so this time was old Jack. He brought the hatchet down, right at the base of the creature's tail. The creature shrieked in pain and disappeared through the hole, leaving its bloody tail twitching on the floor. When the tail at last lay lifeless and motionless, old Jack bent slowly down and picked it up. At first it disgusted him with its naked, pulpy flesh, so he began to walk to his door in order to throw it outside for his hungry dogs to rip into shreds, when he noticed how heavy it was in his hand. There was a lot of meat on it. At that moment, as the last pangs of his fright wore off, he remembered suddenly his intense hunger, and his stomach rumbled again. He remembered, too, the days of the past, when he knew the sweet taste of chicken and turkey legs, and those of pig and lamb, too. The meat around the joint of a leg was always the sweetest. So, too, it was with the meat of a creature's tail. And so, without thinking any more of it, he threw the tail into the old pot with the beans, skin, bones, and all. And next to no time a wonderful smell filled the cabin. Old Jack waited as long as he could, then took the pot out of the fire. The beans were still a little hard, but he didn't care. The meat tasted wonderful. It was more than just a meal to keep him alive. After the little battle in the cabin, it was a victory feast, a warrior's portion. He ate it and felt glad, heroic, full to the core of himself. With his stomach happy, old Jack plugged up the hole in the floor with some old rags. Then he got into bed and drifted off to sleep. He hadn't been asleep too long when a sound woke him up. It sounded like something was trying to claw a hole through the wall of the cabin. Old Jack sat up in bed and looked around, trying to figure out which wall the sound was coming from. And then he heard,
"Taily-po, taily-po, I want my taily-po."
The voice came from somewhere outside the door on the porch. It was horrible, deep, rumbling and strange, and not to be shrugged off as the sound of a beast. Old Jack jumped out of bed and called to his dogs.
"I know. You know. Calico, chase that thing off."
The dogs, who strangely had never sensed the thing's presence till now, started barking and scrambled their way out from under the porch. At their snarls, yammers, and yaps, the creature could be heard scampering away, leading the dogs off into the woods. Old Jack listened as their barks grew more and more distant. He stayed up until he heard them return, one by one, back under the porch to go to sleep. Then, relieved, he climbed back in bed and pulled up his blanket. He was just about to drift off to sleep again when he heard the scratching sound again. This time it sounded like it was coming from one of the windows. Whatever this creature was, it really wanted to get in. He heard the strange voice again, mewing louder this time.
"Taily-po, taily-po, where is my taily-po?"
By now, old Jack was getting shaky. He eased up to the window and yelled to his dogs.
"I know. You know. Calico, see what's scratching on my house."
The dogs came running and chased the critter back into the woods. Old Jack was too worried to sleep. He ripped the blanket off his bed, wrapped himself up in it, and moved back to his old chair by the fire. He sat there listening, waiting for his dogs to return. They never did. A restless sleep soon overtook him. The scent of smoke awoke the old man at dawn. He opened his eyes and leapt from his chair, kicking the blanket off him. The edge of the blanket had found its way into the fireplace sometime during the night, and the wool was now smouldering. Old Jack stomped on the blanket, trying to put out the flames that were now consuming it. He cursed and jumped back, nursing a burned foot. Thick smoke, heavy with the scent of burnt wool, filled the cabin. Old Jack coughed, his eyes streamed. He picked up the blanket by the corner, ran to the window, opened it, and threw the blanket out. He stood there for a moment, gulping in the fresh air and fanning the smoke. The sun was shining. Birds flitted through the tree branches and searched for food in the snow. Old Jack looked around. There was no sign of the strange, tailless critter. His foot throbbed. Old Jack limped back to the bed and sat down. He propped his foot up and laid back, exhausted from the events of the night, and he fell into a deep sleep. In his dreams, he watched as a darkness rose and engulfed him.
Taily-po, taily-po, you've got my taily-po.
The sound of scratching seemed to reverberate from every corner of the cabin. Jack searched frantically for his hatchet, but he was so frightened He couldn't find anything. The scratching grew louder and louder.
Taily-po, taily-po, give me back my taily-po.
Jack yelled back.
Leave me alone. I ain't got your taily-po.
Jack had never been so scared in his life. He ran back to his bed and jumped in. The scratching and the voice grew louder and louder and louder.
Taily-po, taily-po, give me back my taily-po.
Jack yelled back as loudly as he could.
I ain't got no taily-po. So why don't you leave me alone and go on about your business? I never hurt nobody or nothing. Just leave me alone.
Jack pulled the covers up over his head and stayed as quiet as he could. But with a bump, 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 he knew the thing was now in his room. Jack then felt the thing scratching at the bottom of the bed, and then onto the cover. Jack eased the cover down to see what was steadily approaching, and then he saw it. The great black creature with pointed ears, long claws, and the glittering, bloodshot red eyes that glowed in the half-light. Eyes that seemed to burn straight through into Jack. Before he could pull the cover over his head again, the thing pounced onto his chest and looked straight down at him and said,
You got my taily-po, and you better give it back to me now.
Jack yelled in terror.
I ate your taily-po. It's gone. I ate it. It's gone. I ate it. It's gone.
And then, with a horrible scratch, 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 the thing began to claw and tear away at poor old Jack, trying to get that taily-po back. Jack tried to fight back, but the thing was too strong. Those claws were too sharp. Jack's screams echoed throughout the mountains and then stopped, leaving a chilling silence. After a month or two without hearing anything of old Jack, the townspeople, led by Cedar Norton, got worried and came looking for him. They hiked up the mountains and through the forest. When they reached his cabin, they found that it had been torn to shreds. There was no sign of old Jack or the dogs. They searched the woods, and they called out to them, but there was no answer. Old Jack and his dogs were never seen again. Ernest Norton concluded this tale by saying that the remains of the cabin are long since gone, and the mountain folk that still live in that area of West Virginia shun those mountainous forests of a night. Occasionally, hikers will stray into the area, and then, it is claimed, if you are brave or foolish enough to be out in those mountainous woods of a night, you might hear far off a noise, a voice on the wind that cries still.
Taily-po! Taily-po! I've got my taily-po!
Your friend and mine, Moon's cat, is hidden somewhere in this video. Did you see him? If you didn't, it's okay. Go back, watch the video again, write the timestamp that you see him in the comments field, and you get the chance to have the next video dedicated to you or someone you care about. But I will warn you, he does hide pretty well. I'd like to thank everyone who comes along and watches these videos. It means a great deal to me, and I hope it means something for you, too. How can we make sure this channel survives? Well, bring 3 or 4 of your best friends to come along and watch the stories too. By telling your friends, the channel can grow. Next time we're returning with a classic, another great story from M.R. James, so I hope you can come along and listen then. Until then, be good, love one another, but don't forget to
Look out for the shadows!